Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Arrow, as well as the series premiere of Legion. Like always, if I'm talking about something that you want to listen to, you can always look in the description down below. I include the time of when I start talking about each of the respective shows I'm talking about. So, for example, if you want to hear what I have to say about this week's episode of Arrow, you can skip to what I had to say about the series premiere of Legion. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is Arrow. So, in this episode, the team is chasing after Walker because basically he's going to Russia to kind of sell the device to kind of like some Russian terrorists, which makes Oliver kind of to cross paths with Anatoly again, which at first I was like, hey, Anatoly, and then Anatoly proceeds to punch him because obviously him and Oliver have problems. The whole circumstance, I don't 100% remember it, even with the preview, but essentially it's some stuff that dealt back in season 2 that Oliver kind of went to a guy for a favor, and at the end of it all, dude ended up dying, and Anatoly's kind of like, oh, one of your brothers is dead, kind of, because Oliver distanced himself from Bratva, but it's like, the conversation comes up later on in the episode. It's like, no matter what, you're part of the Bratva, and you always will be, which that's definitely going to like turn into something, especially because the big theme in this episode is the fact is that Oliver hates the fact is that he's kind of being dragged back to Russia, because being back in Russia reminds him of who he was back then. When he originally came back to Starling City and everything, being the hood, being the vigilante, because it was like he wanted to move past that. He wanted to become a better person. The whole point of becoming the Green Arrow, that kind of changed that to not be that person anymore. And now he's kind of having to face his past again. And that's definitely, obviously going forward, especially with what Anatoly says, like he's probably going to come to Oliver for help in the future. Because a big theme in this episode is like, because Oliver having to confront the fact is that he still feels the way he does. Like this whole Prometheus thing has gotten inside of his head like never before, because to him, it's like he's worried about the fact is that he's corrupting everyone around him, and that he's starting to believe the words that Prometheus says. Two great examples in this episode. The fact is that Diggle went off the reservations like he did, like completely beating up the guy, even though Oliver's like, yo, we're not going to do that. Like, obviously, Oliver was kind of threatening him, like, oh, I'm gonna shock you and everything. He's like, the fact is that Oliver's like, the fact is we torture him or whatever. There's no guarantee we're going to get the information we need. He'll probably just say whatever he wants, just whatever we want him to, just so that we stop, And the fact is that you had Diggle being super like aggro, being like, no, that's not how we need. We need to stop Walker now. Is like even going as far as beating the guy up. Now, to me, I'm trying to break it down as to why Diggle would be like that, and I guess it kind of makes sense, because the fact is that, this guy ruined his life, because, he went back to the military as a means of kind of getting a fresh start, and then he kind of had that all taken from him, He even had men that were relying on him and had his side, killed, and he's kind of labeled as a traitor, was going to be, sent away, if not having Walker kill him. And it's just like, this is a guy that could threaten his family, come after his family. He even kind of uses it later on in the episode, like, oh, you can try and kill me. Don't forget, the fact is, I'm a powerful person with powerful connections. I could come after you and your family. So it's stuff like that where it's like he needs to be taken care of because he's a threat to my family. And that's how I see it, plus, being locked up and everything. It's like, he's done so much to Diggle in such a short amount of time. He destroyed a lot of Diggle's life. I mean, but so I guess you can look at it like that, but more so than anything, the fact is that he could threaten, his family. That's one big reason as to not, let him go. But then on the other side of things, you had Felicity kind of crossing the lines a little bit in a sense of, she uses the flash drive she got from that group last episode. I think the girl's name, I was looking at it this episode, I think her name's Alina. Essentially, she uses it, basically information she has on it to blackmail a guy. Essentially, she made Rory, I love the fact that she got Rory and Curtis to basically pretend to be Bratva, and she has a conversation with the dude to kind of get information on Walker and his men and stuff like that. She even went as far as, but like, she using the information, like the guy was like, don't, like, if you do this, like, if you report me, kind of tell other people about what I'm doing, they will come after me, they will kill my family and everything. She's like, well, you best do what I say then, so we can avoid that type of situation. And then, Rory kind of confronts her later on and like, what was that about? And she tells him about the drive and everything. And he kind of he talks about his dad with the rags. It's like, the fact of the matter is these rags are powerful and everything, but you have to use them, responsibly, that you can't abuse the power. And he's kind of saying the same thing for Felicity. Like, you cannot abuse his power. Like, she's like, but Felicity's defense is like, these are very bad people on this list. Like, if to take down some of these people, you gotta play a little dirty. You have to do whatever tactics is necessary. But for Rory, it's kind of the mentality of like, if you do bad things to catch these bad people, even though they're bad people, what makes you any different if you go about doing things the same way they would, by using, forcing people's hands, using very, very bad tactics to handle situations like this, because that's kind of like, it's something that Dinah kind of puts into Oliver's head, that basically, like, the fact is you're focusing too much on the negative aspects of what Prometheus says about, yes, you influence the people around you. It's like, that's what anyone does to everyone. So I don't think your case is isn't special. Like, you're special. The fact is, focus on the good things too, because the good things that you pass on to other people, you inspire other people. It's like, yeah, Felicity and John might be going down a dark path, but the fact of the matter is they will listen to you because they believe in you. And he kind of talks to them because it's like, yo, it may be the end of the road for me. I don't know, he's still, because with this whole Prometheus situation, it's kind of brought up whether or not he could have redemption. Last episode kind of brought it up to him too, when the whole Dinah situation. Doesn't know if he'll be up for redemption or not, and it'll be if it's even possible for it, but it's not too late for Diggle and Felicity. The fact of the matter is they're still very good people, and the fact is that they can't keep going down. They can't go be better than him, prove Prometheus, and even prove it to Oliver that the fact of the matter is, no matter how tainted he may be, that the fact is that they can come through this fine, that they'll come out of it actually on top, and everything kind of prove that, no matter what, they will stay on the right path. Which Diggle later on tells him is like, you're wrong, Oliver. The fact is, me and Felicity aren't corrupt, better than you. We're actually all on the same level. We as a team make each other better. That's why we work so well together, because we keep each other grounded. We bring each other back from crossing that line. Which, the thing that comes up in this episode is that Felicity's like, she's talking to Elena, and she's like, the fact is, you need to keep using the list. And she's like, oh, she doesn't plan on stopping now. Which is kind of something I brought up last episode, like continuing to be caught up in this group. The fact of the matter is, she thinks that she's doing a good thing, which, I mean, who's to say she isn't, but she's probably going about it the wrong way. Because the fact is that she didn't tell anyone about it. Because even under these circumstances, I doubt even Oliver still 100% knows about what Felicity's done. I'm sure even Rory was never able to really go into details about everything that she has access to, because there's a lot of information. But it's a circumstance of it's literally the same situation as Oliver's, that, if she crosses the line, who's to say what will be the ramifications of doing what she's doing? Basically, Oliver's suffering the ramifications for what he's doing, and it's just, he went after a lot of very bad people, and, by any means necessary, and you see what is happening to him. I think, it's a situation where Felicity just wants to do some good in the world, that, she wants to do it by any means necessary, but she doesn't think how deep these ramifications might go, because it won't just be her affected, it'll be everyone too. But another thought that crossed my mind is, it's something that came across my mind just now that I was wondering, because season 4 set up Hive. Obviously, we saw some of the head honchos of Hive, but what if this group she's actually getting information from is actually Hive? I didn't even think about that till just now. Because the whole point was I thought we're kind of setting up Hive to be the main antagonist of season 5. Obviously, that's being Prometheus, but who's to say maybe Hive won't continue to be a problem later on? But maybe this is kind of setting that up. Because what does she really know about this group? It's yeah, they have a lot of information on a lot of people, but what if at the end of this all that she ends up finding out these people are only having her help them because they're trying to help themselves? It's crushing other people, oh, take care of these evil people who control this particular trade or whatever, and once they're taken care of, you kind of swoop in and take over that business. So what if this is Hive trying to accumulate all these evil people's businesses and kind of incorporate it into themselves and make a crap ton of money that basically Felicity's just being used? I feel just there's so much more to this, because it's she doesn't even know who this group is. It's but it's, she's so caught up in getting back into her hacktivist days and wanting to do something more. I guess it's a situation where it's she's always behind a computer and I guess maybe she feels like she's not doing enough to contribute with everything. But now that she has all of this information in her spokesman, she's oh, I can do something about it. So I'm just very curious to see how that all plays out. And another thing that kind of popped up interestingly in this episode is the fact is that Dinah came along. Obviously she's a new person to the team and everything. But what's really fascinating is the fact is, I forgot. I was like, all right, she is a cop. So that's going to be an interesting perspective because obviously, like, everyone's got their own different training and everyone's got their own. Because when you actually break down a team, everyone's got their own thought process in the way that they learn what they've learned, know what they know. Obviously, Diggle comes from a military background. You have Oliver having been trained by so many different people to learn and think and know things. But it's like, you take Dinah, for example, her training as a cop will make her think like, oh, think like a cop. So it's like something interesting. It's kind of a new perspective on things, because she even brings up the whole like, oh, tracing, you know, she made a suggestion to Felicity that kind of panned out, and I was like, huh. I thought, oh, maybe that's kind of her cop brain kicking in. So that was just kind of interesting. This episode also saw to the return of Deputy Mayor Lance from his rehab, and he wants to have a talk with Susan, basically live on camera and everything. While they're off in Russia, Oliver leaves Renee behind. Well, one reason is because he can't have Renee kind of going there in Russia and be kind of off the wall crazy and end up causing like a diplomatic incident. But it's also the fact is that, you know, I'm sure Renee on some level probably chose it too because of what he talks about later on. Apparently him and Lance actually knew each other. They actually came, he's like, he might not remember. The fact is that, you know, he was like tagging a place, and then Lance was like, yo, go off and do something bigger, you know, better with yourself. And kind of gave him a second chance. He's like, oh, subsequently, since that you put me on the right path. And then he was like, and Lance was like, well, didn't you get dishonorably discharged from the military? And he's like, hey, people make mistakes. So kind of saying like, you know, even across up the right path, you slip every once in a while, you come across some bumpy roads. But the thing is that Renee was there for him to kind of, you know, help him kind of be like, so to kind of keep his cool, because basically, you know, for Lance, he's had, like, for Lance, life has been up and down. He's always had to worry about, like, coming to the realization, like, oh, my daughter's dead. Having him come back, and it's always been so much, and it's obviously, it took its toll on him health-wise and everything. But this circumstance is different, because Laurel is dead, and there is no going back. Obviously, there's the whole time situation, spear of destiny type of thing that might happen. But even in a situation like that, it might not be something where him or anyone else noticed the fact is that Laurel isn't gone. But I'd like to say, I still don't think it's going to play out that way. It could easily play out that way. Like, talk about that in Legends of Tomorrow, because everyone might decide, like, no, it's too much of a risk. They can't do it. Things have to be the way they are. Maybe they'll change their mind. We'll just kind of have to wait to see. But so now he has to kind of submit with the fact is that his little girl is gone and there is no coming back for her. The fact is that, you know, and there's no other way to cope with it. You know, he can't drink anymore because that's not the right way to deal with it. And, you know, because Renee was there kind of acting as Susan, being like, okay, he knew Susan was going to hit him with some hard questions. Like, the fact of the matter is you don't, you know, want to go in this underestimating her. Obviously, she hits a lot of people hard balls. And so he started bringing up questions. Oh, what about you working with Damien Dara? What about your daughter's death and everything? Which pissed Lance off. But then he was like, you know what? The fact is, you know, he understood what, you know, Renee was trying to do for him and everything, trying to really be there and be supportive for her. Because, you know, in Renee's mind, he doesn't hold back. It's like, he's like, I'm not even going to apologize for doing what I did or said what I said. I'm sorry that, I mean, it sucks that it bothered you. Obviously, you were right to be bothered, but the fact of the matter is kind of have to keep your cool during this interview. But it turns out, you know, she ends up going easy on him later on, and you know, Lance ended up finding out, like I mentioned before, the whole past situation with them. And it turns out that Renee kind of talked to her, told her about that moment. So she kind of went a little easier on him, kind of realizing, oh, this is the deputy mayor, you know. So some other final notes of the episode. Rory ended up stopping the explosion from that bomb or whatever. Because at first Felicity was like, oh, I need to do this. And he's like, wait, another like similar circumstance to Rory's hometown. I was like, oh, we're just going to have to sacrifice more people. He's like, oh, don't worry. I'm going to just use my bandages and I'm going to cover it, try, you know, subside the explosion. And he did successfully. But it messed with his rags. Maybe it's something specifically in, maybe it was too much and it damaged his rags to a certain extent because they're not the magic that they are. Because he brings up the fact that they have a bond, but he can't feel it anymore. So there's something wrong, and he's like, he has to leave for a while because it's like, he can't be there because he's just going to be a liability to them, you know, especially with this whole Prometheus situation. So they gain another member to kind of replace the fact that Artemis is gone. You know, they got Dinah, but now it's like they're losing Rory. I'm sure he's going off to try and fix this whole situation. So maybe it was something in the chemicals, maybe something in his, like, maybe it's kind of a mental thing where it's like something in his mind kind of was a little off that he kind of decided to, like, you know, I don't know. There's a lot. There might have been, like I said, specifically just been tied to like a certain chemical that kind of threw off the supernatural ability of his rags or something like that. So not unless she ended up finding, because the fact is that there's a bond with his rags. Maybe it's not just magic. Maybe there's actually a spirit, like a person exists within those rags, and maybe that person's unconscious. I don't know. Just randomly throwing that out there. It sucks that we won't be seeing him for a while, but he said he will be coming back, so I kind of hope he will be. And the final note I want to bring up, well, no, there's actually two other notes I want to bring up in this episode. One is the whole circumstance about Susan. I knew things weren't settled the moment Susan starts like asking all these questions, like, "Oh, you went to Russia and everything." It's like, "Oh, you have all these scars. What's this tattoo about?" I was like, "Oh, and he's like, "I'll tell you eventually. I just can't get into it right now." I was like, the fact that she's looking like that, she's not letting it go. Literally, maybe a minute or two later, it's like, oh, she's talking to that guy because she knows all about his Bratva past. So, like I said, at the beginning, I couldn't really tell where she was going to lay on, like where she fell on that situation. Was she trying to be with Oliver just because she wanted answers? Like, it does seem like she legitimately likes him, but then it turned into a situation of like, oh, did she ever really like him and she's just using him? Or was it a situation where she does like him, but she finds herself conflicted because there's a reporter inside of her that wants to kind of break this case, but at the same time, it's like, she doesn't want to hurt him because she actually has feelings for him because she spent time with him and got to know him and got to see all the wonderful things he's doing. But especially knowing now, like, who he was and who he is, like the green hood. Now she's kind of piecing it all together, like, oh, Oliver Queen, like she sees, like, because basically there was a photo that was taken that basically showed the hood, because it kind of ties into the flashback in this episode of him and Talia attacking a place. It was kind of a trial run to see if he was really ready and whatnot. But and now she's pieced it together. Oh, the hood Green Arrow is Oliver Queen, and you see a look on her face like she's like, it's not really happy. Like, oh man, I just broke the story. It's like, because she had a happy look on her face when she found out that he was part of the Bratva, that he had a past with him. But now knowing that there's a lot more, because it does seem like there's a part of her that does want to get Oliver's side of the story. So what she does with that, I don't know. We have to wait and see. I am very curious to see what she does, because like I said, it does seem like it is a conflicted heart type of situation where whether she goes behind Oliver's back or not, I don't know, because the whole point is to keep the identity separate so he can be Oliver Queen but also be the hero that people need without endangering everyone around him. I mean, it's kind of interesting because it's not even a circumstance of endangering all the people around him, because all the people Oliver surrounds himself with as, Oliver Queen are all people that know who he is as the Green Arrow. So I'm sure this is all something did kind of cross my mind too. Like, I mean, we know that Prometheus is that dude's son, dude that Oliver killed back in the day. This is his son. Well, what if we ended up finding out that he didn't have a son, that he actually has a daughter? Because it's like, well, what if Susan's actually... Well, no, because I feel like that wouldn't come as a surprise about the whole Oliver Queen Green Arrow situation, because, Prometheus actually knows who he really is. The fact is, we still never seen Prometheus' face, and I'm wondering, is it going to be something where it's like, oh, when it's all said and done, when Prometheus' face is revealed, that we actually have seen him at some point throughout the series, whether it was something early on in the season, or whether it's something more recent, or the fact is, it's going to be like a flashback to reveal, like, oh, Oliver crossed paths with this person before, just not realizing who each other was, or the significance of what their eventual future held for him, or something like that. So, and another thing is the fact is, because Talia was basically, obviously setting Oliver on his path and telling him, oh, you need to leave the Bratva, and he was getting ready to, until he saw Anatoly, who had gotten beat up, basically the whole Gregor and Constantine relationship, because he brought up the questions and got beat up for it. And Oliver's like, he came there to tell Anatoly he was leaving, but the fact of the matter is, he was like, what matters right now is, let's take it Gregor and Constantine down. Because initially Oliver had, when in present day, when he was talking to Anatoly, he was like, Anatoly still owed him for the Gregor situation. So I'm guessing that's something that we're going to find out a little bit more going forward, of what it was exactly that even Anatoly kind of admitted, okay, the fact is, you're right, I kind of owe you for that. So overall, a very good episode. So many developments that I'm very interested to see how things play, especially the whole Walker situation, because it's obviously Argus has kind of stepped in to kind of handle it and make sure he doesn't really get access to anybody, because obviously he's still alive and everything, because Diggle chose not to kill him, which was the right move to make. He's like, nah, I'm gonna make you, face justice, because it also, Oliver, Diggle also brought up the fact is that he had threatened his family, like Walker had threatened his family just like Andy did, but the exception is he didn't kill him like he did Andy. So Because we already know what killing Andy did to him. It set him back like that. And I guess it's like, he's like, I made that mistake once. I'm not going to make it again. So very, very good episode. Cannot wait to see what happens next. So. And now moving on to the series premiere of Legion. So before I get started, I will preface by saying I'm not that familiar with Legion, like at all. Like, there's certain, even though I'm not well versed in the Marvel universe, even when it comes to mutants and stuff, obviously there's the main ones like Wolverine, Jean Grey, Cyclops. I know the basics about. Legion, I know next to nothing about. Obviously, it got brought up in this episode, but it's one of the things I'd already previously, it's one of the few things I did know about him. It's like he's literally one of the most powerful mutants. What the exact extent of his power is, I don't know. Obviously, he's very telekinetic, which makes sense considering certain familial people in his family. Obviously, if you know what I'm talking about, I don't want to spoil it because I don't know how that's going to play out or be kind of like a big twist in the show to anyone that doesn't know. It's kind of going into this blind, so I won't obviously spoil familial connections he has to other people. Even that's probably a spoiler in itself, so I do apologize. But nevertheless, other than that, I really don't know much about him. And like I said, so far we obviously seen his telekinesis is his main thing. Seems like hearing voices, obviously like kind of like the telekinetic pushing of stuff like that is part of his arsenal, but we don't know if that's all there is to it. Like how, because to me, like I could be completely wrong about this, and I'm fine with being wrong because, like I said, this is someone I don't know. But I swear I have a vague notion that Legion has the power to basically do any and everything. That basically, if a mutant's power exists, he can kind of do it. I don't know whether it's kind of like an osmosis thing where he can kind of like absorb it, or whether it's a kind of like he can copy it or something. I don't, like I said, don't know the full extent of his powers. Even to, because they even bring it up, obviously, him being the most powerful mutant. So obviously we're going to get to see that more in the future. But that's there. Like, I'm going to reel it back in and just talk about the episode. Obviously, our main protagonist of the show is David, who, it's an element about this episode that I really liked. And I'm curious if they're going to continue it for the rest of this season or not. Maybe not. But the whole mentality of like, oh, am I crazy? Because I've basically been hearing voices and moving stuff with my mind for all of my life, but everyone thinks I'm crazy. Or, do I, really have powers? And that mentality of not being able to tell the difference, tell what's real and what's fake, I really like that. It adds a certain element to it because I walked into the show not really knowing anything about what the setup would be. Obviously, kind of knew the whole, like, thinking he's crazy for having powers and stuff like that, but I didn't really know how it would be kind of displayed because obviously we find him most of the time spit at a facility known as Clockworks. It's a psychiatric facility, and a lot of weird stuff. There's also like his friend Lenny, played by Aubrey Plaza. What I'm curious about to see is if obviously we know her circumstances later on in the episode. Kind of another example of like what his powers are exactly is the fact is that she was dead inside of a wall. Like part of her body was sticking out of the wall. She had kind of fused with the wall because basically his powers had activated, and basically everyone, I guess, got sent to their respective rooms or whatever, or at least got sent to their rooms, and the doors were removed. Like they no longer existed. There was just a wall there. So that was kind of interesting. But the fact is, at one point later in the episode, he sees her inside of his head after the whole facility incident situation. She's dead, but she's kind of a ghost in his head. Now I'm wondering, is she going to be a persistent character or not? Because something I could be completely wrong about, and once again about his powers and everything, is I had this vague notion. Maybe I'm confusing him. Maybe it's not even a Marvel character I'm confusing him with. Maybe it's a character from something else entirely that I'm confusing him with. But I could have sworn that basically his powers are so much that basically he has to split his mind into other personalities to kind of control his powers. Once again, I feel like that's vaguely associated with him, but more so than anything, I'm throwing it out there, but I'm pretty sure that's like someone else's power I'm thinking about. Once again, I'm not sure if that's necessarily 100% like Marvel, mutant or inhuman ability. But then again, it's like I said, I don't know. I was wondering, like, because that's what I was like, because I was watching the episode, I was like, it's like Lenny and some of these other people actually inside of his head. Is even Sydney real? Is she someone inside of his head? Which, circumstances kind of like, well, technically, just because we ended up finding out that Sydney is mutant herself. Because I kept wondering, I was like, why does she want to be touched or something like that? Because I'm sure, she was under the same circumstance of maybe she was kind of like she was probably there because she didn't know about her own abilities too. It's not until probably after she left or whatever. But nevertheless, like her and David kissed, and obviously her power awakens, and it's because that's why she avoided touching people so much. It's because basically when she touches someone, she switches places with them in the sense of they switch minds, that she was in his body and he was in her body. That's why the whole incident at Clockworks happened, was because she was in David's body and he, you know. And the way Lenny described it is he was a grenade launcher that went off. It's like, you know, so. But when he was on the outside as Sydney, at one point he ended up switching back with her. But it wasn't just switching minds, they switched places. Like the moment, like, you know, I guess her power, either she kind of learned how to control it and tapped into it. Because obviously some people showed up, so maybe they showed up and helped her kind of understand her powers. I'll kind of get to that in a second. But maybe that's why the switch happened. You know, normally she'd probably have to be there to touch the person again too, because it's a skin-on-skin contact situation. So when they kiss and everything, that's when they switch. But he was back in his own body, but sitting in the place he was sitting at when he was in Sydney's body. So it's not even just switching minds. It seems like she can also switch locations with people if need be. Maybe it's a situation where it's like not only are their minds swapped, but the fact is their minds and bodies are connected. So when the brain swaps, so did, I mean, I don't know. That's kind of a circumstance of like, oh, we got to wait a little bit to find out more about her powers and everything. Because she also apparently has the power to not only enter your mind, but also enter your memories. Once again, going back to the fact is, I thought that kind of be more his abilities, you know, with the whole telekinesis thing. Like I said, this is early stages, kind of getting everything introduced. I'm sure it'll kind of get built upon as the season progresses about like, oh, this is what everyone can do. Because there's even that character, there's that moment later on in the episode that I really like. Literally at the breakout moment of the episode where like literally you have like bullets flying everywhere and you have that one dude kind of waving his hand, tossing boulders as well as people like they're nothing. So it's like, is he have telekinesis? Like what? You know, it's like, I'm obsessed with figuring out what people's powers are to find out what they're capable of, how their powers really manifest themselves. Like, is what he doing really telekinesis, or is it something else entirely? Is it not really a telekinetic ability? Maybe it's more so a levitation ability, you know, that he's not moving something with his mind, but he has the power to lift himself as well as any other object if he kind of puts enough force behind it. I know I'm not about to try and get all scientific with it because I wouldn't know how to begin to be all scientific about it, so. But getting back to the fact is that she can enter people's minds, and more particularly their memories, because obviously he's remembering something, and then all of a sudden he happens to turn around and her face is on the back of someone else's head. It's like, whoa, what? It's like, wait, you were here? And she's like, no, I'm not really here. The fact of the matter is this is me talking to you in one of your memories, so. But kind of going back to an earlier thing I was bringing up about the whole, like, oh, is he crazy? Is he not? The fact is that you had those government agents essentially playing along and making him think like, oh yeah, the fact of the matter is it's all in your mind. Even that guy that was sitting at the desk talking to him and everything, keeping his pen on the table just to kind of keep David calm so he wouldn't activate his powers. Because it's like one of the guys was like, yeah, some people are like, yo, we should go ahead and put a bullet in him because he's too dangerous and everything. But at the same time, the guy was like, oh, I just want to talk to him a little bit more, kind of understand him a little bit more, what he's capable of, what he can do. Because essentially, they much like the other group that you end up meeting at the end of the episode. Her name is Melanie. Her and her people were looking specifically for David, but they ended up finding Sydney instead because they switched bodies. But at the same time, they were also probably, you know, this government group was also looking for Sydney as well, because it seems probably in general they're hunting down mutants in general. And it's like, because obviously a big, you know, X-Men storyline has always been, you know, the difference of like, oh yeah, kind of the racism between humans and mutants. That's always been a big storyline. And so I guess I can only assume it's like, oh, this government agency exists to keep mutants under control or captured. Like, the more deadly a mutant is, the more likely that they're just going to put a bullet in it, or, you know, other times just capturing him and studying him. I mean, like I say, in David's case, they had basically injected him with something so his memory was fuzzy. That's why he was having such a hard time remembering, because at one point he sees like the two people that was chasing him in this episode, who turned out to be Melanie's people. He saw the guy that he was talking to the entire, like, most of the episode get out of the cartoon. He's like, I wasn't there. It's like, oh, so I was like, oh, is he lying or is he actually undercover? It's like, no, it's because his memory was a little fuzzy. He implanted that dude in his memory in the wrong place just because they injected him. So it was him not being able to remember exactly what happened, like how he got to where he was. Because they were basically saying like, oh, we're police here asking about the incident and everything. When actuality, it was just them trying to pump him for information. Another thing I'm curious about going forward with this is his whole family situation. More, I brought it up earlier, but I mean, in particular, his sister. Is that going to be a consistent thing or what? Like he living with his sister because obviously he's like, oh yeah, I got out, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna stay here for a little while with you and your hubby. Which I do like when the fact is that he had the whole episode with Lenny and the lamp ended up breaking and his sister came down. Oh, you okay? He's like, yeah, the lamp broke. She's like, oh, she happens to look on the wall and there's all those garden tools and everything. She's like, oh, I'm gonna take these. Ben's gonna, do some gardening or whatever, and she takes the axe too and walks away. I really love the fact is that obviously she knows the circumstances. Because what really drove him to be there in the first place is the fact is that he tried to kill himself. He tried to hang himself. But apparently when the police got there or whatever the case may be, there was actually no noose found. All they found was kind of like burn marks, like kind of burn rope marks around his neck. So it's like, so was it more of like a psychic hanging or was it like his powers kicked in and it's like his power, because he brings it up, he's like the voices inside of his head didn't want him to kill himself, which kind of throws back to the point I'm trying to make is like, I don't know, maybe, are them, like, is it a situation where there's a lot of people inside of his head? Is it just like he's reading a lot of people's minds all at once and that's what's happening? Because there's certain things, obviously, in the opening that are unclear. Just that moment he's outside, all those people are crowding him in the rain and everything. So it's like, are those people's thoughts he's hearing? Or are those people? I feel like that was kind of supposed to be like a live manifestation of like him hearing all those different people's thoughts all at once and just having them like jumbling like kind of bouncing all around his skull and everything. So. And then there's that whole thing about the devil with yellow eyes. It's that thing that he kept seeing in his head. And obviously it's not, I mean, it's associated with just his mind in general because when Sydney was in his body, she ended up looking at it and seeing it kind of stand up and approaching him. It's like, what the hell is that all about? Like, the Marvel Universe is weird, so obviously that's not just something inside of his head. That's probably something in itself. Whether it's necessarily devil, I don't know. I do know that death actually has a manifestation in the Marvel Universe because there's a whole like thing between kind of a love triangle situation between her, Thanos, and Deadpool. I'm not a big comic book person, but that's one thing that I've always heard. I even know because of the whole Deadpool game because that's kind of a whole thing because he's always got a crush on Death. It was kind of puts Thanos in a bad mood type of situation. But that's always I don't know whether like this devil with yellow eyes is another mutant or is it something along that same level of like because it does it. There's a lot of things scattered across the Marvel Universe. And because, obviously this is X-Men related, they must be something mutant related. Because I know because then you start getting into it like, who owns what between Marvel and Fox. And it's like Fox has the rights to mutants. That's why Marvel doesn't use the word mutant. That's why a lot of their stuff has been pushed between like, enhanced people and Inhumans, because that's kind of the only properties they have left because they don't have properties such as the Fantastic Four as well as, Deadpool or what that means going forward. I don't know. Obviously, people want both combined together. Some people it's like fine with them staying separate. That basically it's better for them to stay separate. I don't know. Like if they decide, I like them being. It'd be awesome if they'd want to come together. That they'd come together. Obviously, that'd be awesome to have Marvel and Fox kind of come together with this whole Marvel, come together with a Marvel deal. Somewhat similar to the whole Spider-Man situation with Marvel and Sony. Obviously, it would complicate things with the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe that they've already set up without mutants, and throwing in mutants would just kind of complicate it. And that's a lot of stuff that it basically would have to go back and reset up. But then there's the whole situation about like, possibly X-Men being rebooted in the movies. So there's a lot of layers, and it's hard to say where exactly Legion falls into all of this. Like where, whether it'll be affected by certain things, like whether it'll have any actual intent. Kind of comparing it to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is affected by the movies, but the movies aren't affected by what goes on in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So maybe it's going to be a situation where, like, Legion feeds off the current storylines that's been set up, the First Class, Days of Future Past, Apocalypse storyline, especially because it's set in that time. I don't think they really said specifically what date it is, but I'm assuming it's obviously the 80s. I kind of had somewhat of an idea that that's what time it's going to be set in, but since it's kind of set in that timeline, that's why I'm wondering if it's going to be pulling from that storyline or not. So, like I said, a very good premiere. It's just like I have so many questions. Figure out who everyone is, who is Melanie, and what is she supposed to be? Kind of like the Professor X of this show? Is she trying to gather gifted people to kind of help them fight, stay free from the government who's trying to imprison / kill them? What other mutants are we going to come across? I'm curious. Is there actually going to be anyone in this show that I know? I feel like it wouldn't be, because of the whole situation of I'm sure there's not going to be any big time mutants, like the go-to mutants that someone like me who doesn't have a very big knowledge of mutants in the Marvel universe wouldn't recognize. I mean, granted, Legion on his own is kind of apparently, I mean, obviously he's a pretty big thing in amongst the mutants, but I don't, like I said, prior to finding out about this show's existence, I didn't even know he was a thing in the Marvel universe. So finding out who this government agency is, what their ultimate goal is, I guess we're not going to see that the dude that was kind of talking to and trying to pump David from all that information. It was pretty sick when that pin kind of went up and just stabbed him in the face. Wasn't expecting that. But it seems like him as well as those other guards got burned. It has to be one of those other two, the two that were following him. Obviously, we got their names in this episode. I completely I'm blanking on them right now. But obviously, all those bodies were burnt to the bone. So it had to be one of their two abilities. So, as I said earlier, I do hope that whole being crazy thing does kind of continue. It's kind of how Deadpool has his whole thing about being crazy, breaking the fourth wall and everything like that, being very referential to breaking the fourth wall and everything. Not necessarily to that extent, but I hope it's a situation because of he's being crazy that his crazy manifests itself as take examples like Lenny being there telling him, warning him, it's oh, they're coming after you, and when they find you, they're going to kill you, and it's oh, don't blame Sydney, it was kind of your body that did this to me. It's oh, being dead's not all that bad. So I don't know, just because for one, there's a part of my brain that's oh, I'd like to see Aubrey Plaza a little bit more. I hope it's not just kind of oh, one-off thing. I just, like I said, I want it to be a situation where it's people inside of his head start having manifestations to actually kind of help him out from time to time, just kind of I forgot what it was. There was a TNT show that was kind of like that, where basically a guy was schizophrenic and Perception. There's a TV show called Perception that had, is it Eddie McCormick? That basically his hallucinations would kind of help him figure stuff out. It's basically his brain's way of being yo, dummy, you missed this. It obviously took on different forms. It could take on someone from his personal life, or it could take on the form of someone like a historical figure, whatever it is that his brain's trying to tell him, but it kind of manifests itself as a hallucination. I'm hoping that something like that happens, just because I think it'd be kind of interesting to see a character like that. Like I said, pushing the Deadpool limits is kind of how I was going. It's kind of how my brain is kind of visualizing that. Maybe it'll turn out not to be the case now that he's kind of solidified. Oh, this is all real. This is all happening. Maybe that complete crazy side of his brain will be completely gone. So we will just have to wait and see. I'm eager. I am very excited to see just what else goes down, with this series. I'm very heavily invested already. So, like I said, especially figuring out exactly what kind of format the show has. Like I said, is he going to be oh, he's doing mutant things during the day, and then he comes back home to his sister making excuses of oh yeah, I'm doing this, that, now. Oh yeah, I got a job. I'm being a very productive member of society, obviously hiding everything from her because he can't let her know that he's, everything is going on, because, obviously she'll just think he's crazy and kind of get him sent somewhere else instead. So, I mean, obviously he'll probably want to keep his distance from her, because the typical, superhero thing of oh, don't want to get the people you love involved and everything. So, I know, once again, we will just have to wait and see. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this episode. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.